A locket shattered on the floor, and with it, a carefully guarded secret. Welcome to Mystery Files. I am your host, Raven. Before we piece this together, comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Your messages truly make this journey unforgettable. Now, let's gather the fragments. It was on a raw February evening, one of those London nights when the fog seems less a weather than a presence, that I first heard mention of the Locket. Holmes and I had been dining quietly at Baker Street. The coal in our grate burned with a steady, comfort-giving glow, yet beyond the window panes the city lay muffled and dim, as if the very lamps had grown weary of their duty. Holmes, stretched in his chair with that air of careless ease which so often hid the most concentrated mental activity, was idly balancing his long fingers together, the tips meeting and parting in a slow rhythm. I had taken up a medical journal, though I confess my thoughts were not so much on pathology as on the strange emptiness that can settle upon a man in moments of calm, an emptiness which, in my companion, was the prelude to sudden flame. For Holmes, peace was never a destination. It was merely a pause between storms. He had spoken little since our return from a country matter in Surrey. Twice I had seen him rise, pace to the mantel, and glance toward the street as if expecting some summons. Then, without warning, he turned upon me with that quick, incisive manner which always suggested his mind had been running far ahead of my own. "You have been reading the same paragraph for the last 5 minutes, Watson." I lowered the journal, startled into a smile. "You are unjust. I've been reading—" "You have been holding paper to your face," said he, dryly. "Your eyes move, but your attention does not. A trifling distinction, yet a very real one. Your left hand rests upon the margin with the forefinger bent. That is your habit when you are bored. Besides, your pupils are not contracted as they are when you truly read by this lamp. You are thinking of something else." "And what?" I asked. "Am I thinking of?" Holmes's eyes gleamed for an instant, never with malice, always with that delighted interest a naturalist might take in a curious insect. "You are thinking that you have not heard the violin in 2 days, and that therefore I am either ill, in want of a case, or engaged upon some line of reasoning which I have not shared with you." I laughed outright. "Then I may add another matter to your list. I'm thinking you are intolerable." "An excellent sign," said Holmes. "When you call me intolerable, you are at ease. When you call me remarkable, you are generally in danger." He sank back again, and I, having no answer ready, returned to my journal with a resolution to truly read it. I had managed 2 lines when the sharp peal of the bell downstairs rang through the quiet of the flat. Holmes's head lifted instantly. The indolent man vanished as if a curtain had been snapped aside. In his place sat the alert, hungry intelligence I had come to associate with the scent of a trail. "There we are," he murmured. "Come, Watson. Our peace has expired." Mrs. Hudson's step was quick upon the stair, as she opened the sitting-room door with a glance that betrayed both curiosity and disapproval of late callers. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," said she. "And a lady as well. Well, sir, they seem in some distress." "Show them up at once," said Holmes. They entered together, one of those pairings which in retrospect seemed charged with significance from the first instant. The gentleman was perhaps 45, tall and spare, with the clean-cut features and over-controlled expression of a man accustomed to command. Yet there was something in the set of his jaw, too rigid, too carefully composed, that suggested strain beneath the discipline. His coat, though of good material, bore the faint damp of one who has walked through fog rather than taken a cab, and his gloves were held, not worn, in a manner that spoke of nervousness. And the lady at his side was younger, perhaps 28, with a veil drawn low, though not low enough to hide the pallor of her face. She carried herself with the upright carriage of good breeding, but her hands, which clutched a small parcel wrapped in dark cloth, trembled in spite of evident efforts to steady them. Holmes rose with a courtesy that was never more sincere than when addressed to a woman in distress. "Pray be seated," said he, indicating the chairs near the fire. "You have come through unpleasant weather. Mrs. Hudson, a little hot tea, if you please." The lady lowered herself, still clutching the parcel as if it were a living thing. The gentleman remained standing for a moment, surveying the room with the guarded eye of one who dislikes to place his affairs in another man's hands. At last he sat, his back straight, to his knees together, like a soldier bracing for an unpleasant report. "My name is Edmund Halbrook," said he. "I am—" He hesitated, then continued as if forcing himself past pride. "I am in the service of Lord St. Clair of Wrotham." Holmes inclined his head. "I know the name. A peer of some standing and not a little controversy. He has been in the papers more than once." The gentleman's mouth tightened. "My lord's affairs have been made too public already. That is why I'm here. The matter we bring you is delicate." Holmes's gaze had settled, not upon the man, but upon the parcel in the lady's hands. It was no more than a square of dark cloth tied with a thin cord, but Holmes looked at it as a mathematician might look at a curious symbol. "And you, madam?" said he gently. The lady lifted her veil. Her eyes were striking, grey, wide, and ringed with the faint shadow of sleeplessness. When she spoke, her voice held the careful modulation of a woman accustomed to controlling emotion, and therefore all the more moving for the effort. "I am Miss Adelaide St. Clair," said she. "Lord St. Clair is my father." A faint change passed over Halbrook's face at her words. Respect, certainly, but also something else. A guarded apprehension, as if he feared she might say too much. Holmes, however, gave no outward sign. "Then you have done wisely to come together," said he. "Family matters, when combined with questions of law or reputation, are seldom best handled alone. Now, tell me what has occurred." Miss St. Clair drew a breath, as if the telling itself were a burden she must lift with both hands. "It concerns my mother," she said. "My father's first wife. She died when I was a child. So I have always been told. My father and I, have never spoken of her. It has been forbidden." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "Forbidden? An unusual choice of word." "It is the only one," said she, her fingers tightening upon the cloth. "If I asked, my father would become cold. If I persisted, he would become angry. Even as a girl, I learned that certain doors must not be touched." Halbrook cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, I must ask you to understand the gravity of this. The lady's mother was connected to matters of society," said Miss St. Clair sharply, surprising me with the steel beneath her gentleness. "Matters of scandal, matters that my father feared." She turned to Holmes again. "2 nights ago, Mr. Holmes, I was in the East Wing. The house at Wrotham is large, and there are rooms seldom used. I have lately been restless. Perhaps because of the season, perhaps because—" She faltered, then steadied herself. "I had been reading in my own sitting room and could not sleep. I took a candle and walked. There is a small schoolroom at the end of the corridor. My schoolroom once. I had no reason to go in. Yet something drew me." Holmes leaned forward, his chin upon his hand. "Continue." "I found the door unlocked," said she. "That was strange, for the East Wing is kept shut. I entered. The air was stale. There were sheets over the furniture. But on the table, upon the very table where my childhood books once lay, there was an object. This." She set the parcel upon Holmes's table with a care that bordered on reverence. Holmes did not touch it at once, but he watched her hands as they loosened the cord, watched the way her fingers shook when the cloth fell away. Inside lay fragments of metal and glass, broken, twisted, and tarnished. Even in that shattered state, one could see it had once been a locket of fine workmanship, oval in shape, with a rim of gold and a delicate pattern engraved upon the back. The center, which might once have held a miniature, was splintered. A jagged piece of glass still clung to one edge like a sliver of ice. There was, too, a narrow strip of ribbon, dark with age, still attached to one of the broken hinges. At the sight of it, something tightened in my own chest, for objects carry with them a strange power. A broken locket is never merely broken metal. It is a ruin of memory. Holmes at last reached out, on taking the fragments between finger and thumb with exquisite delicacy, as though they were evidence in a laboratory rather than the relic of a human life. "And you know this belonged to your mother?" said he. Miss St. Clair nodded. "I did not know until I saw it. But when I held it," her voice wavered, "I remembered a scent. Lavender, perhaps, or something like it. I remembered a song. I remembered hands smoothing my hair. I cannot explain it, Mr. Holmes. I had no clear image of her face, yet the moment I saw this broken thing, it was as if a curtain stirred." Holmes's eyes flicked up. Memory is often attached to senses rather than pictures. A sound, a scent, a texture. The mind preserves what it can. Halbrook interjected, his voice restrained but urgent. "The locket was not there before, Mr. Holmes. I oversee the household matters. The east wing has remained locked. The keys are kept in my charge, yet the schoolroom door was open. The locket lay in plain view, and—" he hesitated. "And there has been a note." Miss St. Clair reached into her reticule and produced a folded paper. Holmes took it, opened it, and held it toward the lamplight. I saw at once that it was written in a cramped hand, the ink uneven, as if the pen had been pressed too hard at times and too lightly at others. The paper itself was cheap, nothing like the thick stationery of a country house. Holmes read silently. I watched his face, always a futile exercise, for he had trained it to reveal nothing when he wished. At last, he handed the note to me. It contained only a single line. "What was broken shall break again." There was no signature. I looked up. "This is a threat," I said. "A warning," said Holmes, "or a promise. Often the difference is only in the mind of the receiver." Miss St. Clair's hands were clasped tightly now, as if she feared her fingers might betray her. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "yesterday my father received a message. It was delivered to him privately. He read it and became—" She searched for the word. "He became like a man who has heard a footstep behind him in the dark. He ordered the east wing sealed at once. He dismissed 2 servants. He forbade me to leave the house alone. He sent Mr. Halbrook to London to find you." Halbrook nodded stiffly. "My lord would not come himself. He does not wish this matter known to Scotland Yard. He does not even wish it known to his acquaintances. But he—" The man's composure cracked for the first time, and I heard something like fear in his voice. "Now he believes this locket is the beginning of something he has dreaded for years." Holmes set the note down. His fingertips rested upon it lightly, as though he could feel the pressure of the unseen writer's hand through the paper. "And what," said he, very softly, "does Lord St. Clair dread?" Miss St. Clair's throat moved as she swallowed. "He dreads," she said, "that my mother did not die as we were told." The room seemed to grow colder, though the fire still burned. Outside, the fog pressed against the window as if listening. Holmes's eyes, half-lidded a moment before, were now fully awake, bright, fixed, and terribly intent. "Excellent," said he, in that quiet tone which always meant the game had begun. "We have, then, not merely a sentimental disturbance, but a question of life and death, past and present. Now, Miss St. Clair, Mr. Halbrook, you will tell me everything you know, and you will omit nothing, however small, however shameful, however seemingly irrelevant. It is in such trifles that the truth often hides." He glanced toward the shattered locket again, and I saw that his attention had already narrowed to a point invisible to the rest of us. Some minute scratch, some tiny distortion, some silent testimony of metal and glass. Watson, the doctor in me, felt compassion for the young woman's distress. Watson, the chronicler in me, felt that familiar stirring, half dread, half exhilaration, at the approach of another of Holmes's strange dramas. But it was Holmes himself, sitting in the warm light of our lamp, with the fog like a curtain beyond, who seemed most alive of all, like a hound that has caught the first faint scent upon the wind. "Begin," said he, and a Miss Adelaide St. Clair began to speak. Miss Adelaide St. Clair's hands remained clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed pale beneath the lamplight. Holmes, who had resumed his seat with that peculiar stillness of his, like a cat before the spring, waited without impatience. He had an uncanny talent for making silence a comfort rather than a pressure. It gave the speaker room to arrange their own thoughts, and, perhaps, room enough for the truth to step forward unforced. "My earliest memory of my mother," Miss St. Clair began at last, "is not of her face. It is of a room, a nursery with a tall window and rain tapping the glass. There was a scent of violets. I remember that distinctly. And I remember a voice, soft yet urgent, as if she were trying to make me understand something important." Holmes's gaze did not leave her. A lullaby?" "No," she said. "Not a song, words. I could not have been more than 4 or 5, but I remember her bending close and saying, 'If ever you are frightened, Adelaide, you must find—' And then the rest is gone, as though someone took the end of the sentence away." Halbrook shifted in his chair, the movement controlled but unmistakably uneasy. "My father says she died," Miss St. Clair continued. "He says she was taken by fever while we were abroad. I've never been told where, precisely. When I asked as a girl, he said it would only distress me, and when I asked again as a young woman, he told me—" Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. "He told me it was unseemly to pry into matters beyond my station as a daughter." Holmes's mouth tightened at the word unseemly, though whether from irritation at the sentiment or at the man who had used it, I could not tell. "And your father," said he, "has never spoken her name in your presence?" "Never. Not once. You know it, however." Miss St. Clair hesitated. "I have seen it in an old prayer book. Eleanor St. Clair." But when I said it aloud once, my father looked at me as if I had struck him. After that, I never dared. Holmes nodded slowly, as if fitting a small piece into a larger pattern. "Continue with the events of the last 2 days." "The night I found the locket," she said, "I did not sleep. I kept it in my room and stared at it until dawn. In the morning I asked Mrs. Weller, our housekeeper, whether she had ever known my mother. She grew pale and said she had been engaged after my mother's time, and that I should not trouble myself with old sorrows. But I saw fear in her. Real fear." "What did you do then?" I asked, unable to keep the question back. "I went to my father," Miss St. Clair replied. "I carried the locket to him. I thought, foolishly, that the sight of it might soften him, that he might tell me something at last." Her voice shook a little now, and the memories seemed to cost her. "He was in his study. I placed the cloth upon his desk and unfolded it, just as I did here. The moment he saw the fragments, he stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. He stared at it, and for a second his face was empty, as though he had been hollowed out." Holmes leaned forward a fraction. He recognized it instantly then. "Yes, he did not touch it. He would not. He said, 'Where did you get that?' And his voice was not his own. And when I told him, he said only, 'It has begun.' Those were his words, Mr. Holmes. It has begun." Halbrook's hand went unconsciously to his breast, as if the phrase had been spoken there. "And then?" asked Holmes. "I demanded an explanation," said Miss St. Clair. "I begged him, I pleaded, She pressed her lips together, collecting herself. "At last he said, 'You must never go into the East Wing again. You must never speak her name. You must never mention this locket to anyone.' I told him I could not obey in ignorance. He turned away from me and, This is what frightens me most. He began to shake. My father is not a man who shakes. Holmes's eyes flicked toward Halbrook. Was this witnessed? Halbrook inclined his head. I was summoned, sir. His lordship ordered me to lock the east wing doors and see that no servant entered, and he dismissed the footman Barrett and the maid Lucy on the spot. On what grounds? Holmes asked. No grounds given, said Halbrook. He only said they had been careless with keys. Holmes's fingers steepled. And were they? Halbrook hesitated. Barrett is foolish but not dishonest. Lucy is new but attentive. The keys to the east wing are kept in my pantry. I carry them. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Always on your person? Halbrook's composure stiffened. As a rule, yes. As a rule, Holmes repeated softly, and allowed the words to hang like a thin thread in the air. We shall return to that. Now, Miss St. Clair, you mentioned a message your father received yesterday. Yes. She drew another breath. It was brought by a boy from the village, one of those errand lads who come to the house for pennies. He said a gentleman in a dark coat had given it to him at the lane and told him it was urgent for my father. The boy did not see the gentleman's face clearly, only that he wore a hat pulled low. Holmes' voice remained calm, but there was an intensity beneath it. What did the message contain? I did not see it, she admitted. My father read it alone, but afterwards he called Halbrook and ordered the wing sealed. He also ordered that the family solicitor be summoned to Wrotham this morning. Holmes's head lifted. Ah, that is important. The solicitor's name. Mr. Vane, said Halbrook. George Vane, of Lincoln's Inn. Holmes rose abruptly, crossed to his escritoire, and pulled open a drawer. I knew that drawer. It contained a sheaf of correspondence, some newspaper clippings, and a little bundle of cards. And he selected one with the swift certainty of a man who keeps a map of London in his head. Vane, he murmured. Yes, an able man. Cautious, not prone to melodrama. If St. Clair has sent for him, he expects legal complications. He returned and sat again, but his manner had changed. It was no longer merely attentive. It had become subtly commanding. Now, said he, we must address the central point. Miss St. Clair, you said you found the locket in your old schoolroom upon the table. Was anything else disturbed? Dust displaced? A drawer opened? A sheet moved? She shook her head. Nothing that I noticed. But I was not thinking of such things. Holmes looked to me. Watson, you will note that the placing of evidence in plain view is never accidental. It is theatre. It means the hand behind it wants a particular reaction. Halbrook gave a short, controlled exhalation. My lord's reaction was certainly achieved. Holmes's gaze returned to him with a sudden sharpness. Tell me, Mr. Halbrook, how long have you served Lord St. Clair? 12 years. And during that time, have you ever heard any mention of Lady Eleanor? Of the first wife? Halbrook's eyes lowered a fraction. No, Mr. Holmes. Holmes' voice softened, yet the question cut deeper. Have you ever suspected there was something to hide? Halbrook's jaw tightened. A great house always has something to hide. Holmes accepted that with a slight nod. Prudent. Now, Miss St. Clair, the note you brought, what was broken shall break again. Was it found with the locket? Yes, she said. It lay beside it, I on the table. And the handwriting, does it resemble any hand in your household? Your father's, Halbrook's, the housekeeper's? No, she said quickly. No, it is not my father's hand. I am certain. Holmes picked up the note again and held it closer to the lamp. His nostrils flared slightly, and I knew he was testing for scent. Then he passed it to me without a word and took up one of the locket fragments. Watson, he said, what do you observe? I studied it as best I could. The metal was bent at one corner, as if crushed by force. The hinge had torn rather than simply loosened. Along the engraved back was a thin scratch running across the pattern. It was broken violently, I said. Not dropped. Not aged into ruin. Precisely, said Holmes. And the scratch? It looks like a scrape from a sharp edge. To a tool. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A tool or a surface. Now consider the message. What was broken shall break again. The writer is not simply recalling an old event. He is promising a repetition. Miss St. Clair's hands rose to her throat. You mean he intends harm? I mean, said Holmes, that someone wishes your father to believe harm is inevitable unless he yields. That is how threats of the past are used, like a noose already half-tied. Halbrook leaned forward. Mr. Holmes, my lord has not yielded to anyone. He is stubborn. If there is blackmail— Holmes lifted a finger. Do not name it too soon. Blackmail is a convenient box into which men place uncomfortable truths. It may be that. It may be revenge. It may be an attempt to force a confession. It may even be something stranger. But we shall not guess when we can discover. He rose and began to pace before the fire, not restlessly, but with the measured motion of a man arranging steps in his mind. One more question, Miss St. Clair, said he. When you found the locket and held it, you said you remembered a scent, violets perhaps, and earlier you spoke of lavender. Which is it? She blinked, confused. Violets, I think, or something floral. It is hard to separate. Holmes stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on her with sudden intensity. Hard, unless the scent is present now. He turned his head toward the cloth in which the locket had been wrapped. May I? He asked. With trembling fingers, she slid the cloth toward him. Holmes lifted it to his face with the utmost delicacy and inhaled once. Shallow, controlled. He lowered it at once, and for the first time since our visitors arrived, I saw a flash of satisfaction in his expression. Bergamot, said he quietly, and a trace of violet water. Not your perfume, Miss St. Clair, not London's common soaps. This cloth has been handled recently by someone who uses a particular scent to mask other traces, or who is careless enough to bring their own habits into the work. Halbrook's eyes widened. You can tell that from— Holmes cut him off. From a life spent paying attention, Mr. Halbrook. Now we shall go to Wrotham tonight. Miss St. Clair stared. Tonight? Yes, said Holmes, already reaching for his coat as if the decision had been made long before he spoke it. Because the person who placed that locket wanted a reaction, and he has had it. He will not wait long for the next act, and neither shall we. He paused, glancing at me with that familiar spark. Watson, said he, pack your bag. I suspect the case of the shattered locket will not remain merely a question of broken jewelry for very long. Within the hour, we were seated in a first-class carriage bound for Kent, the fog of London thinning behind us as the train cut its steady course through the night. Miss St. Clair and Halbrook occupied the opposite seats, their faces pale in the swaying lamplight. Holmes had drawn his long coat about him and appeared at first glance to be asleep, yet I knew from the faint tension in his jaw that his mind was racing far ahead of the wheels beneath us. I ventured no interruption. When Holmes withdraws into that inward silence, it is less a retreat than an advance along unseen lines. Miss St. Clair clasped the parcel containing the locket upon her lap, and I observed that she no longer trembled. Resolve had taken the place of fear. It is remarkable how swiftly courage may rise in those who feel the ground of their lives shifting beneath them. We arrived at the small station nearest Wrotham shortly before 10. The night air carried the sharp scent of damp earth and wood smoke. A carriage awaited us, sent, no doubt, at Halbrook's instruction. As we drove through the winding lanes, I caught occasional glimpses of hedgerows looming black against the star-lit sky. The countryside possessed a stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the land itself held its breath. Wrotham House emerged at last from the darkness, a broad, stone-fronted structure with tall windows and an austere symmetry that spoke of inherited wealth rather than recent extravagance. Only a few windows were lit. The east wing, I noticed at once, lay in darkness. A footman admitted us without ceremony. His expression betrayed the tension that must have gripped the household since the previous day. We were conducted to a study panelled in dark oak. A single lamp cast a pool of light over a heavy desk. Lord St. Clair stood beside it. He was a man, perhaps in his late 50s, tall with iron-grey hair brushed straight back from a high brow. His features were sharp, almost ascetic, and his bearing rigid with habitual authority. Yet when he turned toward his daughter, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also a protective instinct so fierce it bordered on desperation. "Adelaide," he said quietly. "Father," she replied. Holmes stepped forward before further sentiment could intervene. "Lord St. Clair, I am Sherlock Holmes. You sent for me." "I sent for discretion," said the nobleman curtly. "If you are that man, then I hope you possess it." Holmes inclined his head. "Discretion is a tool, my lord. Truth is the objective. They are not always at odds." The older man studied him for a moment, as though weighing whether to resent or respect the reply. At length he gestured toward the chairs. "You have seen it?" he asked, indicating the parcel in his daughter's hands. "I have," said Holmes. "And the note?" St. Clair's jaw tightened. "Then you know that someone seeks to resurrect what should have remained buried." Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he walked slowly about the study, his gaze sweeping across the shelves, the desk, the hearth. He paused near a small escritoire in the corner. "You received a message yesterday," he said. "Or may I see it?" Lord St. Clair hesitated, then opened a drawer and withdrew a folded sheet. Holmes examined it beneath the lamp. I leaned closer. Unlike the earlier note, this one bore several lines. "The past is patient, but not silent. You have hidden what was broken. Prepare to see it whole again." There was no signature. Holmes compared the handwriting to that of the first note. His eyes flicked between the strokes, the pressure, the spacing. "The same hand," he murmured. Deliberately disguised as unpracticed, yet the slant remains consistent. The writer presses hardest on downward strokes, a habit not easily altered. Lord St. Clair's composure faltered. "What does he want?" "That," said Holmes calmly, "depends upon what he believes you fear most." A silence settled over the room. Adelaide's gaze shifted between her father and Holmes. "My lord," Holmes continued, "I must ask plainly, did your first wife die as publicly recorded?" The question struck like a physical blow. St. Clair's face drained of color, then flushed darkly. "You exceed your bounds." Holmes did not flinch. "On the contrary, I step precisely within them. Your daughter's safety may depend upon your answer." Adelaide drew closer to her father. "Please," she said softly. For a long moment he said nothing. His hand rested upon the edge of the desk, fingers rigid. "She was reported dead," he said at last. "There was a fever. Yes, but there were complications." "What kind of complications?" Holmes asked. St. Clair's eyes shifted briefly toward Holbrook, then back to Holmes. "She disappeared." The words seemed to echo in the heavy room. She left our lodgings while we were in Florence," he continued in a strained voice. "There were rumors, vile rumors, of associations unfit for a woman of her station. I received a letter days later, unsigned, implying she had chosen to abandon her name." "And no body was ever recovered?" Holmes asked quietly. "No." Adelaide swayed slightly. I stepped nearer, fearing she might faint, but she steadied herself. "You told me she died," she whispered. "I told you what was necessary," her father replied hoarsely. "A scandal would have destroyed us." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden clarity. Then the locket was broken at the time of her disappearance? St. Clair stared at him. How could you know that? Because the message promises that what was broken shall break again. The writer refers to an event known only to you and, possibly, to Lady Eleanor. The locket is a symbol, one connected to that event. The nobleman sank slowly into his chair. It was found in our rooms after she vanished, he admitted. Smashed against the marble hearth, I believed, God help me, that she meant to sever all ties. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. And you kept it? I locked it away. I would not have it destroyed. I told myself it was for my daughter when she was older, but I could never bring myself to speak of it. Holmes turned to Adelaide. Then someone has gained access not only to your house, but to an object long concealed. Where was it kept? In a small iron box, St. Clair said, in the strong room adjoining the study. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the wall behind the desk. May I? Without waiting for refusal, he crossed to the indicated door. The strong room lay beyond, windowless, lined with shelves. The iron box rested upon a lower shelf. Holmes examined the lock closely. It has been opened recently, he said. The key? St. Clair produced it from a chain about his neck. Holmes inspected both key and lock. No visible tampering, which suggests either a duplicate key or access during a moment when you believed yourself alone. Halbrook stiffened. My lord never parts with it. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Never? A pause, brief but telling. Only when bathing, St. Clair said tightly, or sleeping. Holmes nodded slowly. Then the circle narrows. The intruder knew of the locket's existence, knew its significance, and wished you to see it broken anew. This is not random malice. It is deliberate design. He closed the strong room door and turned back toward us. Lord St. Clair, he said evenly, who, besides yourself, knew the true circumstances of your wife's disappearance? The nobleman's eyes darkened. No one, he said. Then, after a moment, more quietly, except perhaps one man, long dismissed from my service. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the spark there, the unmistakable sign that a path, however faint, had revealed itself. And his name? Holmes asked. Lord St. Clair did not answer at once. He remained seated, his gaze fixed upon some indistinct point beyond Holmes' shoulder, as though summoning a memory he had long kept at bay. His name, he said at last, was Jonathan Mercer. Holmes did not interrupt. He was in my employ at the time we traveled abroad, St. Clair continued. A personal secretary, clever, efficient, and... His mouth tightened. Too observant. I dismissed him shortly after our return to England. For what cause? Holmes asked. For insolence, St. Clair replied sharply. Then, after a pause, and for presumption, he involved himself in matters beyond his position. Holmes's eyes rested upon him with quiet insistence. Matters concerning your wife. A flicker of irritation crossed the nobleman's face. He insinuated that Lady Eleanor's disappearance was not what I publicly declared. He hinted that he possessed information which, if disclosed, would prove embarrassing. Blackmail, I ventured. St. Clair's silence was answer enough. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace slowly across the study. You paid him? For a time, St. Clair said curtly. Then I refused. And I dismissed him and warned him that further attempts at coercion would be met with legal action. And did he persist? There was one letter, St. Clair admitted. Years ago. After that, nothing. Holmes stopped pacing. Until now. The word hung between us like the final note of a chord. Adelaide, who had listened in growing distress, spoke at last. You never told me any of this. Her father's voice softened despite his evident strain. I sought to protect you. From the truth? She asked quietly. Holmes turned slightly toward her. Miss St. Clair, the concealment of truth is often a misguided form of protection. It has the unfortunate tendency to ferment. He faced Lord St. Clair again. This Mercer, where is he now? I do not know, St. Clair replied. He left my service 12 years ago, and I have not heard his name spoken since. Holmes's gaze drifted to Holbrook. And you, Mr. Holbrook, you succeeded Mercer, did you not? Yes, Holbrook answered evenly. I was engaged shortly after his dismissal. Did you ever meet him? Only once, briefly. He came to collect some personal effects. Holmes regarded him closely. What impression did he make? Holbrook's brow furrowed faintly. He was self-assured, polite in manner, yet resentful beneath it. I recall thinking that he believed himself wronged. Holmes inclined his head. A useful recollection. He returned to the desk and lifted the threatening letter once more, examining it under the lamplight. Mercer would have known of the locket's existence, he said thoughtfully. He would have known its emotional value and its symbolic weight. Adelaide drew nearer. You believe he has returned? I believe, Holmes replied, that we must consider him as a principal possibility, yet we must not be seduced by the convenience of a former enemy. The writer wishes you to think of the past. That may itself be a stratagem. St. Clair rose abruptly. What more could he want? He sought money before. I refused him. Holmes' voice remained composed. Men who fail in one attempt do not always abandon their objectives. They refine them. He crossed to the window and drew back the curtain slightly. The grounds lay dark beyond, the faint outline of trees barely visible against the sky. The east wing, he said. I should like to see the room where the locket was placed. St. Clair hesitated only a moment before nodding. Holbrook will conduct you. We passed through silent corridors, our footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floors. The house seemed to listen as we moved. Adelaide walked beside her father, her hand lightly resting upon his arm, as though to reassure herself of his solidity. The east wing lay colder than the rest of the house. The air carried a faint mustiness as of rooms long closed. Holbrook unlocked the door at the corridor's end and stepped aside. Holmes entered first, holding a small lantern he had taken from the hall. Its light revealed a modest schoolroom, dust-sheeted furniture, a narrow desk, a faded map still pinned to the wall. There, Adelaide whispered. Upon the central table lay nothing now. The locket had been removed. Yet Holmes approached the surface as though it still bore its evidence. He knelt and held the lantern low, examining the wood grain. His long fingers traced the dust. Interesting, he murmured. What is it? I asked. The dust has been disturbed, he said, but not merely by the placement of the locket. There are faint impressions, 2 sets of marks. He rose and gestured for me to look. I crouched beside him and perceived at last the subtle differences. The broader sweep where the locket had lain, and beside it, almost imperceptible, the outline of something cylindrical. A candle, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. Our intruder required light. The house was dark, therefore he did not possess intimate familiarity with the layout, or he wished to avoid using household lamps. Holbrook frowned, but the doors were locked. Holmes straightened. Locks deter the honest. They do not prevent the determined. He crossed to the window. It was latched, but Holmes examined the frame with keen attention. There are slight abrasions here, he observed, near the lower sash. From weather, St. Clair suggested. No, Holmes said softly, from a tool inserted to lift the catch. He opened the window cautiously. The night air flowed in, cool and damp. Outside, beneath the sill, lay a narrow flower bed bordered by gravel. Holmes handed me the lantern and stepped carefully onto the ledge. Holmes, I exclaimed. Merely observation, my dear Watson. He lowered himself onto the ground and bent close to the gravel. After a moment he called quietly, Come down. I followed as best I could, though with less grace. Holmes indicated the gravel path. "There," he said. At first I saw nothing. Then, gradually, the pattern emerged, faint depressions leading away from the wall. "Footprints," I whispered. "Indeed," said Holmes, "and not recent ones of household staff. Note the heel, narrow, sharply defined. A city boot, not country wear." Halbrook leaned down beside us. "They lead toward the grove." Holmes nodded. "And from there, one may reach the outer lane without passing the main gate." He rose, brushing gravel from his hands. Our visitor entered by the window, placed the locket and note, and departed the same way. He wished the discovery to occur, but he did not wish to be seen. Adelaide's voice trembled slightly. "You speak as though he will return." Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "He has begun a narrative," he said. "Men who craft such theatrics seldom abandon them midway." He glanced toward the dark grove beyond the garden. "If Mercer, or whoever stands behind this, believes he commands the stage, we must allow him that illusion." St. Clair looked at him sharply. "You propose a trap?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "I propose," he said, "to give our adversary precisely what he expects, while preparing for what he does not." Holmes did not at once elaborate upon his intention. Instead, he stood for some moments gazing toward the dark grove beyond the gravel path, as though measuring not merely the distance to the lane, but the temperament of the man who had crossed it. The lantern light cast sharp angles across his face, giving him an aspect at once ascetic and predatory. "At what hour was the locket discovered?" he asked suddenly, turning back toward Adelaide. "A little after 11, she replied. "I'd been reading. The house was quiet." "And the following morning," Holmes continued, "no servant reported unusual sounds in the night?" Halbrook shook his head. "None, sir." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then our visitor is cautious, but not reckless. He entered on foot, avoided the main drive, and relied upon darkness rather than familiarity with the household routine. He wished to be seen only by the one person whose reaction he sought, Lord St. Clair." The nobleman's jaw set. "Then he shall not have it again." Holmes gave him a keen look. "On the contrary, my lord, he must." St. Clair stiffened. "You suggest I submit to this intrusion?" "I suggest," Holmes replied calmly, "that we convert intrusion into exposure. If the object is to unnerve you, then composure will disorient him. If the object is to provoke a confession, then silence will frustrate him. But above all, we must give him opportunity to act under conditions of our choosing." We returned to the house by the same route, Holmes carefully noting the depth and spacing of the footprints before they were disturbed. Once inside the study again, he seated himself at the desk and drew a sheet of paper toward him. "My lord," he said, "you will write a reply." St. Clair stared. "To whom?" "To the unseen correspondent. There is no address." "There need not be. The boy who delivered the previous note may be found in the village. You will entrust him with this one, instructing him to give it only to the same gentleman who employed him before. Such men rarely resist observing the effect of their handiwork." St. Clair hesitated only briefly before taking up the pen. What shall I write?" Holmes dictated slowly. "You will say, 'I have received your message. If you possess information you wish disclosed, you will present yourself at Wrotham House tomorrow evening at 9. I will meet you alone in the east wing.'" Adelaide gasped softly. "Alone?" Holmes did not look up. "Appearances, Miss St. Clair. Appearances are often the most useful tools." St. Clair's hand trembled slightly as he completed the line. When he had finished, Holmes read it over and nodded. "Excellent. Now, one further detail. You will add that you are prepared to rectify what was broken." The nobleman's pen paused. "Rectify?" "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "It is sufficiently ambiguous to invite confidence without promising anything definite." The note was sealed and entrusted to Halbrook, says who was dispatched at once to locate the village boy. Holmes watched him go with narrowed eyes. "You suspect him?" I asked in a low voice. "I suspect everyone," Holmes replied. "Suspicion is not accusation, Watson. It is merely the refusal to exclude." Adelaide remained near the hearth, her face pale but resolute. "If he comes," she said, "what then?" Holmes rose and approached her with an unexpected gentleness. "Then we shall learn whether Jonathan Mercer has indeed returned, or whether some other hand manipulates these strings." "Do you believe my mother lives?" she asked suddenly. Holmes regarded her steadily. "I believe nothing without evidence, but I observe that the writer's language is theatrical rather than mournful. It suggests leverage, not grief. That, in itself, is instructive." Lord St. Clair turned sharply. "As if Mercer dares—" Holmes lifted a hand. "Anger will not serve us. Preparation will." The remainder of the evening was spent in quiet arrangement. Holmes requested that no word of the impending meeting be given to the servants. The east wing was to appear sealed and undisturbed. The study adjoining it would remain dark. At 8:30 on the following night, Lord St. Clair would enter the schoolroom alone, carrying a lamp, and leave the window unlatched. "And you?" St. Clair demanded. Holmes's eyes glinted faintly. "I shall be present, though not visible." When at last we retired to the guest chambers prepared for us, I found Holmes already removing a small case from his valise. Within lay several items I had seen employed in prior stratagems: a coil of fine cord, a dark lantern, and a small revolver. "You anticipate violence?" I asked quietly. "I anticipate desperation," he replied. "A man who has waited 12 years does not re-emerge for trifles." He extinguished the lamp and lay back upon the bed, yet I could hear by the steadiness of his breathing that sleep did not claim him swiftly. The following day passed under a strained semblance of normality. St. Clair conducted his affairs with rigid composure. Adelaide remained near him, though her eyes betrayed an inward storm. Halbrook reported that the village boy had delivered the reply as instructed. The mysterious gentleman had accepted it without question. He said only, "Tell his lordship I shall attend," Halbrook recounted. Holmes absorbed this with a slight inclination of his head. "Confident," he murmured. "Perhaps too much so." As dusk settled once more upon Wrotham, and a peculiar stillness descended upon the house, even the servants moved with subdued tread, sensing that something unusual was afoot, though ignorant of its nature. At 8:30, Holmes and I took our positions within a narrow closet adjoining the schoolroom, the door of which stood ajar by less than an inch. Through that slender aperture we commanded a partial view of the table and the window beyond. Lord St. Clair entered at precisely 9, bearing a lamp. His figure seemed older in that uncertain light. He set the lamp upon the table and stood waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. The minutes stretched. Outside, a faint rustle stirred the gravel. Holmes's hand tightened ever so slightly upon my sleeve. A shadow crossed the window pane. The latch lifted with the faintest click, and slowly, deliberately, through the window began to rise. The window rose no more than a few inches at first, as though the hand upon it tested not only the catch, but the air itself. Lord St. Clair did not move. His posture remained rigid, though I could see by the tightening of his shoulders that every nerve within him strained toward the sound. The sash lifted further. A gloved hand appeared upon the sill, followed by the brim of a dark hat. The figure that drew itself through the opening moved with deliberate care, lowering silently to the floor within. He was of medium height, spare in build, his coat collar turned up, his face partially obscured by shadow. For an instant he stood motionless, listening. Then he removed his hat. The lamplight fell upon sharp, intelligent features and eyes that gleamed with a peculiar intensity. "Good evening, Lord Saint." "Oh, Claire," he said softly. St. Clair's breath caught. Mercer. So the name had a face at last. Jonathan Mercer inclined his head with a faint, almost mocking courtesy. "I see you received my communications. You have trespassed upon my property," St. Clair replied, his voice steady by evident force of will. "Speak your purpose." Mercer's gaze flicked briefly about the room. Direct as ever. Very well. I've come to complete what was left unfinished 12 years ago. St. Clair's hands clenched behind his back. "You extorted me once. You shall not do so again." Mercer smiled faintly. "Extortion is such an inelegant word. I prefer restitution." "Restitution for what?" St. Clair demanded. "For injustice," Mercer said quietly. "For the fate of a woman who trusted you." The words struck like a blow. Then Holmes's hand brushed mine in the darkness of our concealment. A silent signal to wait. "You presume too much," St. Clair said. "Do I?" Mercer's tone hardened. "Shall I recount the night in Florence? The argument? The shattered locket against the hearth? The letter you intercepted?" St. Clair's composure faltered visibly. "You knew she intended to leave," Mercer continued. "Not for scandal, as you declared, but because she had discovered something she could not abide." St. Clair's voice dropped. "Silence. Or what?" Mercer retorted. "Will you silence me as you silenced her?" At that, St. Clair stepped forward. "Take care." Mercer's eyes flashed. "I took care for 12 years, my lord. I held my tongue. I accepted your payment. But conscience is a troublesome companion." Holmes leaned close to my ear and whispered. "Observe, he accuses, but does not accuse of murder. His language is chosen carefully." Mercer continued, his voice low but intense. "She did not die of fever. She left your house alive, and you let the world believe her dead." St. Clair's face was ashen. "She chose disgrace. She chose freedom," Mercer countered. A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken history. "You have no proof," St. Clair said at last. "I have her letters," Mercer replied. There was a faint intake of breath from St. Clair. "She wrote to me," Mercer went on. "She trusted me. She feared you would prevent her departure if you learned the truth, that she had discovered your financial deceptions, the debts concealed beneath your title." Holmes's fingers tightened briefly upon my sleeve. "She confronted you," Mercer said. "So the locket was broken in that quarrel. She left the house that night. I met her at dawn. She intended to travel under another name. And yet," St. Clair said hoarsely, "she vanished." Mercer's expression shifted, anger giving way to something more complex. "She boarded the train to Paris," he said. "She wrote once more, then nothing. I searched, I inquired. There were rumors of illness, but no confirmation. I believed you had arranged matters." St. Clair stared at him. "You believed I murdered her?" "I believed you capable of it," Mercer replied bluntly. The accusation hung heavy in the lamplit air. Holmes moved then. With swift precision he stepped from concealment, his presence so sudden that Mercer recoiled a pace. "You believed much, Mr. Mercer," Holmes said calmly. But belief is not fact." Mercer's eyes darted toward the window, but Holmes had already positioned himself between the intruder and escape. "Sherlock Holmes," Mercer breathed. "At your service," Holmes replied. "You have displayed admirable patience and regrettable theatrics." Mercer straightened, regaining composure. "You hide in closets, sir. Is that your method?" "Only when the conversation promises enlightenment," Holmes returned coolly. "Now, let us proceed without posturing. You possess letters?" Mercer hesitated, then withdrew a small packet from within his coat. Holmes accepted it and scanned the contents swiftly. "They are genuine," he said at last. "Lady Eleanor writes of her intention to leave. She writes of discovering irregularities in your accounts, Lord St. Clair. But she does not accuse you of violence." Saint. Claire sank into a chair, his strength seeming to drain away. I never harmed her, he said faintly. I was a fool, yes. I concealed debts. I feared exposure. But when she left, I believed she meant to shame me publicly. I told the world she had died to protect our name. And my daughter. Adelaide, who had crept silently to the doorway during the confrontation, now entered fully into the light. You let me mourn a living mother, she said, her voice breaking. St. Clair bowed his head. Holmes folded the letters carefully. Mr. Mercer, you assumed the worst and sought leverage through suggestion rather than revelation. You broke the locket anew to awaken guilt and fear, but you have no evidence of crime, only suspicion. Mercer's shoulders sagged slightly. I wanted him to confess. To what? Holmes asked sharply. To financial embarrassment. To cowardice. These are not felonies. Mercer's gaze shifted to Adelaide, and for the first time regret flickered there. I meant no harm to you, he said quietly. Holmes's voice softened, though it retained its edge. Intent does not erase consequence. You trespassed. You issued threats. That is actionable. St. Clair rose slowly. No, he said. There has been enough concealment. He faced Mercer squarely. You will give me those letters. I will make arrangements to amend what can be amended. My daughter will know the truth. As for you, if you seek restitution, it shall not be wrung from shadows. Mercer studied him long, then nodded once. Very well. Holmes stepped aside from the window. There will be no police tonight, he said. But understand this, Mr. Mercer. If you attempt further manipulation, you will find me less accommodating. Mercer inclined his head stiffly and departed the way he had entered. Silence settled upon the room once more. Adelaide approached the table where the shattered locket lay. Was she alive then? She asked softly. Holmes regarded her with measured honesty. She left of her own will. Whether she survived beyond that journey we cannot yet say, but the lie of her death was born of pride, not blood. St. Clair covered his face with one hand. Holmes turned toward me with that faint, almost weary smile I had seen after many cases. What was broken, he said quietly, was not a life, but trust. And that, Watson, is often the more fragile. As we left Wrotham the following morning, the fog had lifted from the grounds. The house stood clear in the pale light, less oppressive than when we had arrived. Pace, do you consider it solved? I asked as our carriage bore us back toward the station. Holmes gazed out across the fields. Solved? He repeated. The immediate danger, yes. The deeper wounds, those lie beyond deduction. He settled back, eyes half closed. Human hearts, my dear Watson, he added softly, are far more intricate than shattered lockets, and far less easily repaired. With that, he withdrew into contemplative silence, and I knew that though the case had concluded, its echoes would linger in the chambers of memory, another testament to the curious interplay of truth, pride, and the relentless clarity of Sherlock Holmes.